Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Colleen Carroll, and I'm a content publishing coordinator at Nexus Marketing and your moderator for today's panel session. Our topic today is financing the future, managing your financials as a nonprofit. And as always, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But also, as always, I do have a few quick logistics to cover before we can actually jump into the conversation. First of all, NX Unite is made in partnership with Nexus Marketing. The NX Unite mission is to make introductions that lead to lasting relationships and serve as a hub for connection in the mission-driven sector. As you saw in our video, on NX Unite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, cause-driven podcasts, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks here with me today. Today's hour-long panel will include time both for questions curated by my team and from you all, our fantastic audience. So at any time during the panel, please feel free to start submitting your questions via the questions tab or directly in the chat, and then we'll use our second half of the session to address as many as we possibly can. So again, the earlier you get it in, the more likely we're going to be able to address it in that second half. If at any point you are having any technical difficulties or have any logistics issues, please let us know. My colleague Malou is under the Team NX Unite username in the chat, and she will do her best to assist. So give a little holler in the chat, let us know what's happening, and we'll figure out how to get you back on and enjoying the session as fast as possible. I did also want to share that this session is being recorded. So if you get to the end and the insight you heard was just so fantastic that you need to hear it a second time right away, that's wonderful news. It's going to automatically be in your email inbox just in the few minutes after the session. So give it about 5 minutes. That email will be there and you'll be able to access the recording. It will also continue to be accessible on the NX Unite website in the on-demand panel section. So if you have any friends in the industry who you're like, can't believe they missed it, they needed to be there, that session was perfect for them, please feel free to share that same landing page that you used to sign up for the session, and they'll be able to access the recording. All right, finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I do want to give a big thank you to our audience, whether you are joining us live or you're watching the recording tomorrow, a month from now, a few months from now. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I hope that this panel is beneficial, hope that you learned something, and also hope that if you are joining us live, you'll submit those questions so we can tailor this conversation to the needs of your organization and the interests of your team. All right, to begin with the introductions, I'd first like to introduce Brian Haney, who is the founder and CEO of the Haney Company. He is a certified association executive specializing in insurance and financial solutions for associations and privately owned businesses. He is passionate about educating and empowering consumers to achieve financial success. Brian is a national speaker, author, podcast host, and mentor operating an independent family owned practice with his father, Alan, and brother, Scott, outside of Washington, D.C. Glad to have you, Brian.
Thanks for having me, Colleen. Very excited to be here.
Glad to have you. Also here with us today is Christian Spiro, who is the Vice President of Sales at Jitasa. He has been with Jitasa since the summer of 2010 and started off as an entry-level accounting representative, working directly with clients on their day-to-day accounting needs. It was his first real job, and he's never left. Since then, Christian worked his way to General Manager of Bookkeeping and Accounting Services, supervising a team of accountants that deliver services to their 1,000-plus nonprofit clients. Christian currently works as the Vice President of Sales. Glad to have you, Christian.
It's good to be here.
Also here with us today is Fred Maglione, who serves as the Chief Executive Officer for File 990, one of the nation's largest tax filing services for nonprofits. As an attorney with nearly 20 years of experience in the nonprofit management industry, Fred has earned the prestigious designation of Certified Fundraising Executive from CFRE International. He also voluntarily serves as a board member and leader for several nonprofits and is licensed to practice law in the states of Florida and Georgia. Glad to have you, Fred.
Thanks. Excited to be here.
Finally, here with us today is Karen Houghton, who is the CEO and founder of Infinite Giving, an automated investment platform bringing a better investing experience to nonprofits. She advocates for organizational sustainability through better financial management. By hedging against inflation, lowering endowment fees, and growing their asset giving, nonprofits can do more good work and help us all have stronger, healthier communities. Glad to have you, Karen.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
All right, we are going to jump in and get started. And Karen, I'm going to have you start us off with our very first question. How
Great.
are financial best practices for nonprofits different today than they were 5 years ago?
If we start with the obvious question, I would say a lot of us have been watching the bank crisis that we've been having and realizing for the first time, some of us, the importance of having FDIC insured deposits. So it's something that I've been talking about a lot, really, really high level for folks who may not know. If you have money sitting in a bank account, banks fail. And that happens sometimes. And so there's different things that you should do, different practices to put in place. But one of the first questions you should ask is, are we FDIC insured? And do they have a sweep program? And if they do not have a sweep program, or often nonprofits kind of have this, where sweep programs, essentially, sometimes it means they'll insure you up to 1 million or 2 million or more. Every bank's a little bit different, but sometimes there's higher minimums. So I was talking to a client earlier today and they were like, well, we have FDIC up to 250, but I can't get a sweep program until I have 3 million. And they were in the middle, which essentially left like $1 million plus uninsured. Now, do we have bank stability? Yes. There's a lot of things about that. And so that's where we usually talk about diversification, especially as an investment advisor. I'm like, do you have a brokerage account? Let's put some money in treasury bills, or instead of a bank money market, do a government money market. So there are different financial strategies that you should be putting in place that I think right now, in a very timely way, we all knew this is best practices, but all of a sudden we're feeling it for the first time, some of us, and knowing why we have that. Kind of like reserve funds, which we can touch on later, but it's like, we know we should have reserve funds. Until COVID hit, a lot of us were like, do we need them? They've just been sitting there. COVID hit for the first time. A lot of us are like, that's why we have reserves. We have a new priority on that. So we're seeing a big priority on healthy banking and diversifying our assets to make sure that A, they're hedging against inflation, and B, that they have that FDIC insurance.
Very timely. Thank you so much, Karen. Fred, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this same question. How are financial best practices for nonprofits different today than 5 years ago?
So I may take it back a little further than 5 years. I think about some of the changes we've seen at the IRS level and are continuing to see. It's been about 15 years ago, the IRS started requiring nonprofits to file, in effect, a tax return called the Form 990. And a lot of nonprofits still don't realize they need to file information with the IRS each year. Around 2019, they started requiring those filings to be electronic. And then in 2020, the IRS proposed some really interesting new proposed rules. They're certainly not yet finalized, but that are going to impact nonprofits that have chapters or subordinate organizations under them and file group exemption or maintain group exemptions. And it's really potentially going to dramatically change the level of oversight and responsibility sort of those parent organizations have with their subordinate or children nonprofit organizations. So it's definitely something to watch. But I think the increased level of IRS scrutiny has been a big change that we've seen over the last few years around nonprofits, and is likely to continue.
Definitely. Thank you, Fred. All right, I want to hear from our other two panelists, but very quickly, I want to point out that we've just had a poll gone live for our audience. If you want to let us know how different your financial management practices are today than 5 years ago, kind of contribute to the conversation, that poll is live. But now I will move over to you, Christian. Any thoughts on changes in the last 5 years? Anything we need to think about?
Yeah. So from our perspective, I think one big thing is being forced to consider remote options and options for financial management and financial controls for people who aren't in an office any longer. I think 5 years ago, really pre-COVID,
that wasn't a consideration for most organizations. And COVID, really changed people's perspective and forced people to consider a work from anywhere, option for a lot of their employees. But specifically when considering that most of their giving is now going to be done online or through some sort of virtual means, having this option for remote context in terms of your financial practices is a big thing that I think a lot of people didn't consider previously, that now people are being forced to do. And it comes with its own headaches, right? It comes with a lot of efficiencies, but can certainly come with its own headaches, especially if you're not used to it. So kind of understanding what that means for you as an organization and wrapping your arms around that, I think is a big thing for a lot of organizations.
Great. Thank you, Christian. All right, Brian, anything you want to add in terms of changes over the last 5 years?
I mean, I can't just say ditto to what the three other folks have already said so eloquently. No, we say this a lot, and I'm sure all of my other panelists have heard this, right? Tax status is not a business model. And I think the thing that we have absolutely seen for a lot of the clients that we work with and a lot of the engagements that we have is how much more true that is, right? Good financial management, due diligence, best practices, that's not a market specific dynamic. Shouldn't matter if I'm for profit or nonprofit. If one day I'm going to sell my organization for some kind of a profit, it still matters that I function in a really effectively financially viable and astute way. So I think that really recognizing that that gap has just closed, right? That, if the NFL and the Salvation Army are structured the same and operate, under a same kind of model, right? We have to understand, all right, well, what does that look like? And I think what we've seen is a significant paradigm shift. And I've liked to ask the question sometimes, which is somewhat provocative. If I was going to sell this organization to someone else, would I run things differently and why? And you got to sit with it for a second, because again, in the nonprofit arena, that concept's really hard to kind of wrap your head around. You're like, wait, that doesn't make any sense to me. And it's not meant to jog you too hard, but it's to really point to, that there are some very critical things that we should be doing to make our organizations as financially viable as possible, to do some planning, some strategizing, to look forward, to have a plan. So that way, when things like, a bank failure happens, we've talked about it, we've thought about it, we know what to do, we can pivot because we got a plan in place. I think the other thing, and Christian kind of touched on this, is don't misunderstand human capital, right? Your people matter, and how you structure things effectively matter. Talent acquisition and retention is as critical now as I think it ever has been. And, high turnover hurts the bottom line of every kind of organization. So, looking at things like employee benefits, not just through, profit and loss and how much it costs me, but really recognizing that things like culture and embracing and using the tools that you have as effectively as possible. These are all things that I think, again, they cut across all markets. It doesn't really matter for a nonprofit, but you really want to find a way to embrace that and have a good strategy for doing that as well as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. We are off to a wonderful start. Very quickly, I want to go to our poll and see where our audience members are at when it comes to their financial management practices today in comparison to 5 years ago. 43% of you said that they are fairly different, but with some noticeable similarities. Sorry, 40%, someone just voted. 33%, mostly the same, but with some upgrades. 13% are at vastly different, and 13% are at pretty much the same. So we are all across the board in terms of how our financial management is today in comparison to 5 years ago, which is just interesting to note. Christian, I'm going to have you start us off with our next question. For the nonprofits on the call that are ready to evaluate their current financial management practices, what advice do you have? What should they be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so I'm going to approach this really from the data side of things, from an accounting and standpoint, as that's what I'm familiar with. But I would say I've got three points that I would recommend people take. One is identify the initial input or point of entry for items, whether that's from a donation standpoint, an expense standpoint, a reporting standpoint, whatever that piece is. identify the initial input point of contact, and then what pain points are associated with that entry aspect. Are there areas that could be improved from an efficiency standpoint, or a data management standpoint, or a document management standpoint? Kind of identify what those items are. I would then say talk to the end user of either that data or of the reporting, whether that's you as an executive director, whether that is a program manager or a department head, or even your board of directors. Like, talk to those people. What do they need out of the end user standpoint, right? What do they need out of those financials or out of that data? What are they doing with the items that they have to perform their function, perform their job, maintain any sort of government or governance over what the organization is doing, and really kind of gather the needs there, and then review those and say, are these being met? Are there pain points with meeting these? Maybe there's a piece of data that's very viable for the organization, but it's really hard to get to. How can we improve a process around that? And then point 3 is, I would take both of these data sets, if you will, to an expert. And don't feel like you have to do this by yourself. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of experience that specialize in a lot of different niches. I would say take it to one of them and say, here's what I have that's a pain point. Here's a data point that I need, to govern my organization. How do I make this easier? And just know that they're going to be the best people to talk to about that.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. Brian, bringing this question over to you. Thoughts on what we should be looking for when we want to evaluate our current financial management?
I'm so glad I get to go second, because again, I'm picking on something Christian said. So this is great. So, technology, we're in a digital economy. It doesn't really matter what we're doing, what our deliverables are. We're in a digital economy. So I think one thing you really do want to look at very strategically is your tech stack, because your tech stack is either helping or hurting you. It's usually nothing in between. You're going to be in one channel or the next. And I think while, the technology deployment that we see in the for-profit marketplace, I find a lot of those organizations really understand, how to deploy things very effectively and fitting into that kind of their overall business model. I think a lot of times I've seen, non-for-profits, associations, and just organizations looking at it more as kind of like a silo. This is the need, and therefore I need to solve this need. And so one of the big challenges, I think, is to have that holistic mindset, seeing all the intersecting elements and making sure that they're all, operating as effectively as possible. Systems and processes matter, right? Data matters, and making sure that, again, it empowers you. It allows you to do things better, more efficiently, and more effectively. It doesn't become a barrier or a stumbling block. I also think, the other point is just to say, be evaluating the strategic plans and objectives that you have. Have a 1, a 3, a 5-year plan. And if you haven't looked at that, be looking at that again. I mean, let's face it, did everything really change in the last 3 to 5 years? Well, yeah, a lot of things really have. And it almost felt like for a little while, year over year, it's kind of like, well, shoot, whatever plan I just had, we just need to scrap and start over anyway, right? So, now is the ideal time to be coming out of this and just reframing everything. And it doesn't mean you're doing this wholesale rebrand and kind of starting over, but it's absolutely that time to just take that dispassionate step back, be engaged with your board and your stakeholders and your members, and just making sure that you have your mission, vision, values, and strategy down packed that's going to lead you forward effectively and successfully for the next 5 years.
Thank you so much, Brian. Karen, over to you. Anything we should be looking for when we're evaluating?
Yeah, I love the idea of taking a step back and bringing transparency to the process, like you guys are talking about. And as a key piece of that, often we kind of get in the weeds with our clients in the beginning, and even looking at some basic questions like, what are your monthly operational expenses? Do you have reserve funds? Okay, well, even how are you defining reserve funds? Because everyone kind of defines reserve funds differently. Or they'll say they have an endowment, but maybe that endowment is actually reserve funds. right? So even just kind of making sure that as an organization internally and with the board, because right, there's often a lot of disconnect between the board and the director of finance and the people doing the books, but really defining like, okay, if these are our monthly operational expenses, do we have enough reserves to where we are comfortable? And I bring that up because Brian, you were talking about the culture and all of that, which is so important. A lot of our clients, when you're a small to mid-size, they're going, that's great, but I don't have money and I don't have time. And like, how do I prioritize all of this? Which you have strategic partners like everybody here on this call, right? But it's also that element of really understanding, okay, if we want to improve the mission and continue to do the good work that we're doing, you have to be sustainable, right? So sometimes when I say scarcity mindset, I'm talking money in, money out, and not giving yourself breathing room and not planning, 12 months, 3 year, 5 year. Sometimes we have organizations who've been around for 10 years and haven't actually set 3 or 5 year goals. And doing that financially and being like, all right, what do we feel is a healthy reserve fund? And for us, we talk about post-COVID, 6 to 12 months of operational reserves is considered a healthy reserve fund or kind of an industry standard. That's a big variable. So in that, it's like, okay, well then what's reserves first are what's above and beyond your 12-month operational expenses. So if you're about to spend whatever's sitting in that bank account in the next 6 to 12 months, that's not true reserves. There's variations if you're doing rolling bookkeeping and things like that, but generally those reserves are above and beyond that. And we always say, go ahead, take that money, take it out of that account, put it somewhere else, right? In treasury bills and a money market, high yield savings somewhere, but you define that and you move that and separate that bucket. And now you start to know, okay, if something happens, where's our emergency fund? What's the sustainability for that? And if you don't have it, then you start to make a plan that's like, all right, every year we will over fundraise by $50,000 or we will over fundraise by $100,000. And then over 5 years, we'll reach our $500,000 goal to have healthy reserves, right? But those reserves exist for the moment when a grant falls through, a pandemic happens, a war happens, right? A donor that was going to give didn't give. That's when you want to dip into those reserves. And they can't just sit in a savings account right now either, because inflation 6%, your savings account. I talked to somebody the other day and they're like, we're so happy with our savings. And I was like, great. What are your returns? And they were like 1.5%. And I was like, that was good 2 years ago, 3 years ago. That is not good right now. So we also will help make plans on like, all right, looking at the market, is your rate competitive? Are there better rates? Because you want to have your money working for you once you kind of get to that place where you have it and have that sustainability. And then you can start making even better kind of strategies and forward thinking. But reserves, I always say, is that first key milestone for creating sustainability in an organization. And sometimes we don't put enough importance on it as I believe we should.
Thank you so much, Karen. All right, Fred, over to you. Anything to add as terms of when we want to evaluate our current financial practices?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I spent a lot of my career raising money. So I often think about some of these things from the fundraising perspective. And as organizations think about financial management practices, I think it's important to think about the fundraising and the donor component to all of that. Sometimes it's little stuff like the way you count gifts and recognize gifts. Your accountants may want you to record a gift a certain way, and you need to follow those rules. But you may want to have a different policy or a different plan of how you recognize donors. Financially trying to manage pledges, a fundraising pledge and a gift over time. Do you have the systems and tools to do that? Not only the way your accountants want to do, but the way that makes it generally easy and effective for the donor, making that gift over a period of time. So I just encourage folks to really think about financial management practices as it relates to the donor. You need to certainly follow those accounting rules, but layer on top of that, be the most donor-centered you possibly can.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. Brian, did you want to jump back in?
Karen made a great point that I just did want to dovetail on a little bit, especially for those that are on this call that are running what would be a small staff size association or an organization, right? Where you're the CEO and then a whole bunch of other C's, right? not many people in too many hats. And I think that this is where working effectively with all stakeholders and having a really deep bench of partners is hugely critical, because the natural tendency is for especially really good leaders to say, if it's going to be, it's up to me, right? And then we're taking on all kinds of stuff that everything demands time, energy, and effort, and it may not be your best time and use. So don't be afraid to step back from all of that. Look at job descriptions. Maybe a job that needs to be done can be outsourced, and leverage your partners. People like investment managers, bankers, insurance brokers, all of that. Having really good partners that can do a lot of things for you so that you don't have to do those things for yourselves is really, really important. Just demand really good experiences from your partners as well. Don't be afraid to do that. Being small doesn't mean you deserve less.
And I would say having partners who have nonprofit expertise, because so often you're like, yeah, bankers or investment advisors or accountants, but what they do for you individually or for a for-profit business is so intensely different than what they would do for a nonprofit. And so I think sometimes we just assume that skill set will completely carry over, but there is so much value in finding somebody who specifically works with nonprofits, because that expertise brings really layered value to you.
Great, thank you both. Brian, I'm actually going to have you start us off with our next question. I think it's pretty interesting based on Karen's just addition. What strategies exist for the for-profit world that would greatly benefit the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, so this is the stuff that I love, and I think it sounds like I know Karen and I are kindred spirits, probably everybody on this call. But, this is really having a plan and a strategy and reviewing on a regular basis. And I think that there are two, maybe three parts to what I'm talking about. The first one is really like that overall mission, vision, values. But what is your brand? What's your ethos? It's not just kind of, this is what we functionally do, or these are, if you donate to us, this is the cause that we support. It's a lot more than that. It needs to encompass everybody that's connected to your organization, right? Culture matters. A lot of times nonprofits get, burnout because you get a lot of really passionate people. But if the culture isn't there to sustain you, then you're not going to have a very effective long-term organizational structure. So be looking at that holistically and building that out, and then breaking it down into components, right? So it's good if you have a lot of departments maybe in your organization. Each department can have its own little mini plan for how it's going to operate effectively, empowering those departments to have their piece of the proverbial pie, so to speak, but to also speak back to the overall plan is really effective. I think the other thing, and I think Fred touches on this a lot, I imagine, take a look at your legal documents once in a while. I can't tell you the number of times when I ask somebody, hey, show me your organizational documents, or, hey, can I just take a look at, the last time your 401k plan document and see who the listed trustee is, and it's somebody that hasn't been with the organization for 10 years. Those things matter, right? So just pull all of that out, dust them off the shelf, make sure that everything's written in accordance to the way it should be today, not the way it was 10, 15 years ago. And I think the last part, and this is, oh my gosh, so critical to be doing annually at a minimum, doing a holistic risk audit, not just from an insurance standpoint, but how am I operating and what are the vulnerabilities? What are the things that I could be sued for or will be sued for? Because in this kind of environment, digital especially, risk has changed. And yet some risks haven't changed, but how you handle them must change. So I think if you weave those three things together, you should be in really good shape.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. Karen, over to you. Anything we need to be learning from the for-profit world?
I think the biggest thing that I wish more nonprofits applied to how they think about things is using an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. And I've been an executive director of a nonprofit, right? And I understand that. I've served on boards, and clearly now we're serving nonprofits as a for-profit company. But the long-term thinking that you need to have to build sustainability and the abundance mindset, to where maybe you're thinking abundance, like, I don't even know where our next donation is coming in. Or maybe you're like, yeah, we have this, but it's already coming in and it's tailored to go to this project. If you want to be bringing in big capacity gifts and you want to keep growing and moving your mission forward, you can't operate from a scarcity mindset. So you have to start thinking really big. And often that means spending some money in the short term to create better strategic gains for the long term. For profit, of course we do that. That's marketing. That's like what you do, right? But in nonprofit world, there's this weird tension where it's like, I can't spend some to bring some in. Or if you do, it just feels highly regulated. And to me, that becomes a broken system. So even the idea of how do you make yourself bigger and more established, maybe even before you are? How are you creating financial strategies to get you to where you want to be in 5 years? One of the things our platform does is help receive asset gifts. So in addition to cash, you've got stocks, cryptocurrency, donor advised fund grants, endowments. I often talk to nonprofits who would be the perfect people for this, because I'm like, I went to your website, it's cash only. And they're like, yeah, but we don't get stocks. Like, do you ask for them? And they're like, no. I'm like, do you have a way to receive them? No. Do you know that an average stock gift is $8,000, but an average cash gift is like $130? Oh, I've heard that. Why aren't you asking for stock gifts? And why aren't you preparing your organization to be able to have the ability to receive those? Right? So that's a very tactical example, but it is one of those things that, is it the chicken or the egg? Well, if you're going to have an abundance mindset, then you're going to think there is surely somebody in your circles who holds an asset, who would give you a gift from an asset. It's the most tax efficient way for them to give, right? And start to make all of these strategic kind of groundwork to help you kind of grow into what it is, your vision and what you want to be in the next 5-10 years.
Thank you, Karen. Fred, over to you. Any lessons from the for-profit world you want to particularly highlight?
Well, I may double back. Some folks have been talking about strategic planning, and certainly I agree with that. You need a strategic plan. What I'd put a finer point or an element of that is just good old-fashioned forecasting and scenario analysis. I think so many nonprofits live sort of budget year to budget year and don't think about that 3-year financial plan. Karen just talked a little bit about how you might think about fundraising a little extra each year to build a reserve. I think developing multi-year forecasts and scenarios. Right? COVID probably taught many nonprofits this, but I don't know if that practice is still in place. What would you do if you had 20% more revenue? Or, conversely, like, how would you operate and fulfill your mission if you had 20% less? So I think really forecasting, just a simple forecasting exercise and multi-budget years and some scenario analysis could really pay dividends and help you, as a leader and the board, think about, where your organization's going.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. All right, Christian, I think you know what question is coming your way. What do we need to learn from the for-profit world?
Yeah, Fred, you stole like 90% of my thunder here. So, but I couldn't echo that more. Just to me, it's the forward-facing analysis that we see many, many, many nonprofits look at a budget to actuals, and so they're doing the analysis of where am I to where I thought I would be, but then they stop with the previous month, right? And so it's always a retroactive facing kind of analysis that they're doing, and then they're just comparing it to what they've budgeted for the year. Which that's a great first step, but you need to take it a step further and understand where you're going. Okay, so you have a budget, that's great, but are you anywhere close to that budget? Did that grant fall through for $100,000 that you were expecting? Well, if it did, that really can pivot if you don't have the reserves in place, but that can really pivot where your organization is going for a current year and therefore for the next year. Right. So just having that ability to look at where you're going and being able to tailor your current plan to where you're forecasting that you're going to be over the next 3, 6, 12, 24 months is really going to be key in terms of being able to sustainably manage the organization.
Great. Thank you, Christian. Very
And
quickly,
Christian, can I ask, I hear this a lot and I know what I would say, but I'd love to hear it. Like, they don't know where they're going to be. So when you're talking about forecasting, right, and we understand financials, but maybe just address, because so much of that is sometimes we're like, why do I want to spend time with that if I don't know where I'm going to be? Like, how do you make up those numbers? How do you do accurate forecasting? How do you walk your clients through that?
Yeah, so I will say we've got a specific team that does our forecasting and analysis piece that are former CFOs in the nonprofit sector. So they focus in on this, right? This is what they're bred to do, really. But as we're looking at that, a big piece of that is kind of going back, and I can't recall who said it, but going back to what your recurring organizational transactions are on a monthly basis, and identifying what those are, and then just the base level of this is what we need in order to just maintain current function, right? It's going to be the payroll pieces, it's going to be rent or the mortgage payment, it's going to be your utilities, your insurance. Those are the things that are going to be a necessity to maintain your business. Now, the more difficult part is the income side of that, right? But there are pieces of that you can get onto a more predictable basis. Having the option to set up a recurring donation each month. That's a huge thing. There's a reason that the for-profit world does a lot of monthly subscriptions, right? It's because it's predictable income. And so the more that you can get donors set up on recurring payments month to month, the more you can predict where you're going to be. And then when you do have the large grants that come in or the one-off endowment contributions that come in, those are going to be, kind of the cherry on top. But a big piece of that is just having a pulse on your fundraising efforts, on your donors, being connected with them to be able to say, confidently, I know this is where I'm going to be next month, and then being able to make a prediction from there into the coming months.
And I think I want to pick up on what Karen, you said earlier, and Christian, what you were just saying. We talk a lot with organizations in this space about revenue diversity. And sometimes that's as simple as something like Karen said, hey, equip yourself just to get more of what you're already going after and make that easier for you, get the numbers up. Sometimes maybe you're an association and most of your revenue comes in from a conference. Well, guess what? When you went through 3 years and you weren't having conferences, I'm sure that hurt, right? So there's revenue diversity just in general. Talking like Christian is saying, let's look at the income side and be strategic and think outside the box and recognize that there might be opportunities now to build and deploy and generate revenue that maybe didn't really exist before. Now is a great time to just look at that very dispassionately, but also really have that kind of entrepreneurial mentality. Get stakeholders involved, get team members, and just really think about that and push the envelope, because there are a lot of opportunities out there, and some can be as simple as some basic changes. Some can be very, very significant and treading new ground that you haven't tread before.
The easiest way to create money is creating money from money, right? So like even taking money in a savings account, I'm not telling you to fundraise more money, but take it from a savings account, making 1.5%, put it in treasury bill. I think today they were yielding 4.85%, right? That's significant money that you can then forecast over a year. And the other day I told an organization, all right, if you do this with these funds, you're going to have an extra $75,000 in the next 12 months. Is that meaningful to you? And they're like, yeah, that's like a whole salary. That's this, that's that. I'm like, great. That's not fundraising more. That's just managing what you already have differently. And then in giving, like recurring, so smart. Yes, every tech company does, a subscription because it works. And then also looking at like what kind of gifts you're asking for. Like if you're just asking for small gifts, the likelihood of you getting larger gifts gets minimized, right? But if all of a sudden you can be like, no, we're capable of receiving these large gifts and we're talking about it and it's on our website and we're making it really easy for donors, then just that change of practice starts to invite in larger gifts as well. And you have to engage in those conversations, but you have to have the infrastructure ready to receive them.
Definitely. Thank you all. Unfortunately, we do have to enter what I'm now calling our speed round as the time is slipping away from us. Too many wonderful things to say. So we're going to try to get through as many of the questions that I'd already sent over to our panelists as well as to our audience our audience questions as we possibly can. And Fred, I'm going to have you start us off with our next question. If teams are hoping to become more efficient with their financial management, what advice do you have?
I mean, I think Brian said this earlier, software, right? Software can make or break, can greatly improve your efficiency and your effectiveness. Really look at your tech stack. There's all sorts of software at all sorts of different pricing points to do little things or big things. Go to software.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. Christian, anything you want to add in terms of being more efficient with our financial management?
Yeah, and again, I think that we've kind of touched on this, these pieces already, but don't do it on your own. There's a lot of experts out there. Be in contact with them. Even if you don't hire one of them, a lot of people will do just a quick Q&A, 15-minute phone call if you've got one thing specific that you want to ask a question about. So lean into the experts, lean into technology. But I would say, additionally, budget for the upgrade. A lot of people will say like, oh, well, it's not in the budget. Okay, well, put it in the budget. Like that's something that you control, so budget for the upgrade and know that it's important.
Fantastic. Over to you, Brian. Thoughts on being more efficient?
I just think that recognizing that every member of the organization has a stake in its financial viability. It's not just the CFO. And so finding a way to make sure that you help your team members know that they can connect to that in some capacity and find out what that looks like for them. And that way everybody can be connected to it and empowered to make the organization as financially healthy as possible. I think that, again, we get so siloed, or we just get focused on our, what our job description is and executing on that, not recognizing necessarily that, we can do either big things or little things to make everything work more efficiently and effectively. So the more stakeholder engagement from the team itself, I think it just becomes a much better and more effective experience.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you, Brian. All right, Karen, anything you want to add in terms of efficiency?
I love simplifying things. So I'm like, don't overcomplicate, simplify the book, simplify how you think about it, really define the buckets and the intention of the money, simplify how you are receiving gifts, simplify all of this. And technology is a great way to do that. Sometimes I talk to folks who have like, great, we have like 7 technologies and we're really overwhelmed. I'm like, great, there are enough out there now. I think we take out like 4 or 5 with infinite giving. You don't have to use all these. You can use one. And so all of that is about simplifying and creating that efficiency. And the last little note, as I was just say, instead of getting overwhelmed by kind of these ideas, think about them as opportunities. It is an opportunity that's going to help you set a better foundation so that your organization can grow. And if you think about that, it's reframing it a little bit, but it becomes much more exciting because then you're like, all right, if we just get through this, think about what more we can do down the road.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's commitment to the speed round. That was wonderful. Awesome. Karen, I'm going to stick with you with our next question. I think we would all rather learn from other people's mistakes than have to make the mistakes ourselves. Any cautionary tales we should be aware of? Any mistakes we need to make sure we're avoiding?
Yes, I would say always have board terms. Can I say that? We often kind of get into that thing where it's just one board member, right? And boards are humans and they're volunteers and they're essential to being a really good, strong organization. But too often, I think really well-intended board members volunteer their time to do something that there's not follow through on, or that they can't do consistently, or they were going to do it and then they roll off and somebody new comes in and they want to do it differently and you have to scrap everything and start over again. So there's different documents that can provide, your governing policies. So maybe instead of, hey, well, there's an accountant on the board and they want to do our books and then there's someone else is going to do the books or they're going to do the audit, you have somebody like Jatasa who can come in and say, great, this is what we're doing. And as the board changes and as staff changes, you have one kind of key partner. For us as an investment advisor for nonprofits, we hear that too. They're like, oh, well, so-and-so on the board's been meaning to put us in treasury bills for like a year. And I'm like, great, how much money did you lose waiting on that person, right? And again, it's all good intentions, but I think really solidifying who can do what and outsourcing the appropriate things to outsource and not relying on volunteers. And again, that goes back to the scarcity versus abundance mindset. If you're operating with a scarcity mindset, we'll just do freebies, but you get what you pay for. And again, it doesn't mean it's always bad, but you're going to get what you pay for. But if you think with an abundance mindset to create really good strategies and good partnerships, you're all of a sudden having a lot of consistent oversight. There's predictability and expertise. And then that also frees you up to go build those relationships and move that mission forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. Fred, over to you. Any mistakes we need to make sure we're avoiding? Any cautionary tales?
Yeah, I've got a great mistake or a terrible mistake I see. At file990.org, we work with a lot of small nonprofits. And what I have seen, again, they try to get away with some cheap tools, and they'll use peer-to-peer payment apps, Venmo, PayPal, Cash App. And unfortunately, they do not set it up in the name or follow the business account setup that the payment app expects or suggests you use. And too often those payment apps are set up in the name of that treasurer, the staff member, the volunteer, with good intentions, right? They want to sell a t-shirt, they want to accept a donation, but unfortunately the IRS considers that income to the individual receiving those funds. And we've seen a lot of folks, too many folks, get hit with giant tax bills full of penalties because the IRS is considering that income to the individual, not to the organization. So if you're using payment apps for anything, be sure you're following the rules of the payment app and setting them up as a business account. It usually comes with some extra fees, but it'll be well worth the headache that the individual may encounter otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fred. All right, over to you, Christian. Any mistakes we need to make sure we're avoiding?
Yeah, not in a specific case necessarily, and Karen kind of touched on this earlier, but especially when I'm thinking of like the accounting, bookkeeping world, we commonly see people that say, well, I have this CPA that was doing my books, and we get in there and they're a complete disaster. And it's nothing against the CPA. CPAs are very knowledgeable and intelligent individuals, but I actually heard this described once as hiring your family practice doctor to do your heart surgery. It's like, well, they're both doctors. They both went to medical school. So I'm sure that my family practice doctor will be fine. It's like, well, no, there's a specialist that can be involved. And, the CPA does a lot of different things. There's a lot of different pieces in the accounting and tax world that person may specialize in. But, nonprofit accounting may not be one of them. So, find somebody in the nonprofit accounting, finance, investment management world, whatever it is that you're looking at, but make sure they have nonprofit experience and knowledge, because the way that you're going to be managing your business as a nonprofit is going to be drastically different than a for-profit business in terms of what your strategies and advice are.
Great. And over to you, Brian. Any mistakes we need to avoid?
Yeah. So in a digital economy, right, there's an app for that. Well, guess what? There's probably an insurance policy for that too. So not to dive into apps, but to talk about risk management, right? Really understanding your vulnerabilities. And I'm not just saying you go out and buy a ton of insurance, but if you don't have a full evaluation and you don't see the risks that you're facing and how you're operating, what you're doing, you actually can't go out and get the right coverage. So the two have to work hand in hand. There's no one universal insurance policy that covers you and protects you from everything. And guess what? Insurance also does not protect you from foolishness, bad behavior, and ignorance, right? So everything has to go and work hand in hand. So do take the time to evaluate the risks that you face, work with the specialist that can take you through that, and then work with an insurance specialist that knows how to design coverage to protect you from risk.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have had a few audience questions come in. We are getting to the end of our time, and we've addressed them a little bit, I feel like. So I feel like that's a good sign. We've already touched on them, but I want to open the door in case anyone has any quick additional things they want to add to answer the questions. One of them was, what is a healthy mix of revenue streams for a nonprofit? How can nonprofits who have a single revenue stream plan for sustainability? Anyone want to jump in and add just a few words to further answer this question?
I mean, I'll since I put it out there first, I'll at least start the conversation. I think that, it's not like the red or blue pill from the Matrix, right? There isn't one pill for every nonprofit to take to answer that question. But, we've talked about kind of thinking a little bit outside the box. So I think really understanding, the first thing I would just say is there are more than one way to generate revenue, but you might just have to be a little bit more strategic, and you might have to look at your operations, and you might have to look at your stakeholders, right? So, if there's a way to partner and bring in revenues, not through maybe an event, but maybe through, online engagement, or, kind of building from where you are and just kind of saying, well, what's the next layer? We've never done it, but maybe we could do X, right? Start small and grow. But there's absolutely different ways to generate revenue. You don't need to get too crazy, but you may need to get a little bit creative. But you do have to just kind of step back and look at how are you doing it right now to start to map that strategy out.
And to add on to that, I think that, to look at probably the biggest area from a volume standpoint, the biggest area of donations is going to be individuals, right? And so if you're thinking as an individual gift standpoint, and Karen kind of touched on this earlier, you can have a single revenue stream, but there can be multiple ways that you can exploit that, right? And so it's like have multiple ways to give for individuals. Have an option for corporate contribution. So as an owner of a business, I can give through my business instead of just as an individual. But also there's corporate matching, that many people don't even know if their employers do match. So having a list of common employers who do matching gifts on file and being able to submit those is another way that you can kind of expand on your revenue stream and diversify your revenue stream when you're really not diversifying your revenue stream. Again, it's not having to fundraise more. It's just looking at different avenues within the current stream.
Fantastic. All right. I do actually have to have us start wrapping up. So I have a final question for each of our panelists to make sure we hear from you all at least one more time. I'm going to admit that it's a pretty big and broad question, but it's my favorite one to end on. So I hope you will bear with me with the grandeur of the question. Brian, I'll have you start us off. What do you see as the future of nonprofit financial management, and how can nonprofits get ahead today?
Yeah, we only have like an hour and a half left, right? So no, I really think it's kind of a collection of everything we're talking about. And probably I see it as a big paradigm shift away from a mentality that, almost transposes these words nonprofit into everything, and recognizes that no, like mission, vision, value, and brand, while they may sound like for-profit and nonprofit words, we really have to think holistically about our impact, about our mindset, our mentality, and move ourselves forward to be doing more with what we have, but recognizing that there are so many opportunities. So I think I think that the words paradigm shift is probably the big thing that for today, what paradigm shifts need to take place in your organization that will allow you to not just be around in 3 to 5 years, but to be the best version of yourself in 3 to 5 years, and to reach people you haven't reached and do things you've never thought you could do. Figure the answer out to that question and adopt it now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. Fred, over to you. Thoughts on the future and how we can get ahead today?
Well, I just think, again, I go back to the IRS, right? I think we're going to see the future is going to be increased scrutiny from the IRS as they upgrade their computer systems and add this supposed 70 some odd thousand employees. Right? It's going to come with a lot more attention on nonprofits. And I think folks need to just be sure they're following the rules, and that's maintaining your tax exempt status, to following the 990, and again, following the IRS rules as a starting point, just to stay out of trouble and make your life a lot easier.
Great. Thank you so much. Karen, over to you. Thoughts on the future and how we can get ahead today?
Yeah, we estimate at Infinite Giving, we estimate that nonprofits could create an additional $5 billion each year just in the US by simply changing their current financial practices. So $5 billion each year, and that's by reducing high third-party advisory fees and investing what's sitting in a savings account and getting better average annual returns. That's really meaningful. And so I think as we become more aware and more educated about, oh, there are different things we can do with our money that are not necessarily high risk. Oh, there are different ways to have returns, or there's different ways to receive assets. Like even that we constantly are now talking about crypto and stocks, like endowments. Endowments are not your mom's endowments anymore. They're unrestricted quasi endowments, term endowments. Like they were created now not just for higher ed and hospitals, right? Small to mid-sized organizations can create these kind of big kind of financial milestones that help you seek sustainability. And I think it's through investing, it's through asset gifting, and it's through modern management of the finances you have in addition to growing them.
All right, over to you, Christian. Thoughts on the future?
Yeah, and I think that we're seeing this more and more in today's world. But again, coming back to the whole tech stack concept, but having nonprofit specific tech that is designed to meet your needs as an organization, I think that we're going to see that more and more as we move into the future. And it's really going to help streamline workflows, streamline outputs, create those reminders to do things that you wouldn't normally think of, like reviewing your insurance policies or reviewing your investment policies to make sure that you're on top of those things on a multi-year basis. But just the document management aspect, I think that a lot of that does come into play with looking at tech. But yeah, to me, the world is going to be drastically changed even more as we move into the future by apps that are able to be kind of plug and play into your nonprofit. And I think that's going to be a very cool thing to see.
Absolutely. All right, with that, we have reached the end of our panel. I want to give a big thank you to our panelists. I know if we were in an in-person setting, there would be a round of applause. So just know that I'm sending that to you emotionally through our screen today. I do also want to give a big thank you to our audience. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I hope this panel was beneficial. Hope it supports the amazing work that you're already doing. And I also hope you will join us for future NX Unite panels. We have a packed spring and summer of panels ahead of us, so keep your eye out on the NX Unite website, the NX Unite LinkedIn, or you can even find me on LinkedIn, and I'll make sure you're up to date on all of our newest panels and what is happening. And very, very quickly, I am going to recommend that if you do plan on joining us for our free NX Unite panels, I highly recommend making an NX Unite account. It's totally free. My reason for recommending this means that when you attend future panels, you're going to start earning what's called cause coins. And when you amass enough of those, you can get some discounts on industry software and some free consultations with some of our friends in the industry. So if you're going to be here with us already, I just want you to get that extra benefit. All right, that is it for me. Thank you all so much for your time. Hope you have a nice rest of your day and keep in touch.